So then we are back with more understandings from the Renewed Covenant, from the Aramaic English translation of the Word. This particular translation comes from the original manuscripts of the Hebrews of old, from the time of Israel, and explains many prophecies related with our time, the end of time, indicating to his people what kind of a path they should take, remaining courageously on the path of Yahweh until the end. Then the Messiah spoke many words, and in the 24th chapter of the first Gospel, the 24th, we find in a section of it related with the end of times. So then it's very valid for us to understand the translation given in English, and this particular translation of ours is extremely wrong. There are many words used, and those words, they make no sense. For instance, the time is at hand, or the time is near, the time is short. Those words were not used in Hebrew. Try to understand the concept. They were very much acquainted with the times and seasons. And then the Shilishim, they had a direct understanding of those times and seasons and prophecies, because Ruach HaKodesh was then living amongst them. And Yohanan, when he was there in the first holy city, example of the city, he had a perfect understanding of the entire scripture. Then the prophecies were then also explained, and he was able then, from the whole history, when then the recording of heaven started, he was able to layer them absolutely perfectly neatly, and he had the understandings in layers per times and seasons and prophecies. So when you read then the time is at hand, he was simply saying explanation of the seasons and the times and the prophecies. What he was saying is the time goes on nearing its completion. As we understand, the Shilishim, they did understand the time and the season of the completion of the spring feast. So then we understand this section of it while the Shilishim were speaking of the completion of. You find in Leviticus the 23rd chapter, the Holy Mikras, Moadim. Spring feast then, he was explaining what it meant. So as then the Shilishim were then experiencing these times and seasons, they were then experiencing its completion. So when he was speaking of the autumn feast, he is simply saying the times and the seasons, the time goes on and nearing its start. It does not mean at the time then when Yohanan spoke, time is at hand, does not mean the time was ending. Because he was speaking of a season of time yet in the future. He knew precisely, he had 1,000 years, and then the other 1,000 years, he knew that it was then from the prophecies of Daniel, the other layer of the 2,000 years, he knew these. He knew the entire scripture in its secrecies. That's why then when you find Revelation so intense, so compacted, it's because each of those understandings, they are not in a chronological order, but in time, in season, and prophecy order. That's why those manuscripts, they had to remain secluded, because only Yahweh through His holy works could then direct the people. A particular time and place in our planet, let's say for instance during the time where then the Shilishim were around, or in the time of the cities after Yohanan's first city, they would not expound a lot regarding those prophecies. The nations would simply get busy with their work while receiving directives. They would not thinking of religion. They would think only simply reporting at the holy cities, presenting the problem, they would get an answer, they would resume their services. They would not be fighting against, this denomination, blah, blah, blah. They didn't have time for this. They had to resume their work. However, those interested in coming often, they want to know what was going on. They were interested, what is this holy Yahweh explaining this holy scripture, and we Gentiles don't understand. Could you explain? Then he would say simply, we are in this period of time, expected this season to come, and when it comes, then this must take place. And they would resume their work. This is how it used to be back then. So when we understand that China is going to take over the entire global trade of the market of the world, people are going to start to get busy. They won't have any more time to play around with denominations and junkies. Try to understand the concept. Then as his people, then they gather around and they cluster and they form holy cities. Then for those interested in what's going on in the future, they would come and report. So we won't have any more of these junky denominations, these then, those are gone. People understand those were deceits. They have to get on with their lives. They have to do trade. They have to get online. They have to understand. They have also to rebuild. Lots of them lost their homes, their houses, and their finances, and then vehicle destroyed. Old, they have to renew. They have to get busy. And there is no more time of mixing junkies and then try to mix with the Gentile ruling and God in the midst of it. He has nothing to do with it. Those were given to the Gentiles. Try to understand. That's why the Messiah, when he spent 2 days with the Samaritans, he was saying, you have the rulership of the secular world, so you can lead on. However, his people would be in charge of giving directives. That's why you find the first 1,000 years, his people then, they were giving directives to the nations. And then the other 1,000, Satan thought he could do it. And he couldn't do it. So then we are returning back to the truth. And people must start to get busy. They can't mix anymore their families and God. It has nothing to do. They have to resume their work. If they are nice people, be nice people. Don't mix God in the midst of it. Their views of God is extremely wrong. It's absolutely junk. That's why then we are returning to the truth. And they have resumed their lives. Forget about their junkies. It doesn't exist. So then in 2009 or 6009, the time of the 1,000 years of Satan deceiving the rulership of the Gentiles, and then also what they thought was God is gone. Only remains the trade part of it, or the rulership of the Gentiles, secularly speaking. And they must get busy yet, as they were busy during the time of Yohanans, so they are going to be busy at the moment. The transitional time. But the space of time, in order for these events to take place, they're going to be extremely fast because of the knowledge increased. Computers and telephones. People there are going to get busy. The time has come for Africa. As we understand, Yohanan then gave the many understanding of the time of the end, and then we are returning to the truth. So then, when you read Yeshayahu, you find there, beyond the rivers of the Ethiopia. And then the word tabernacle tabernacling, meaning His presence. It's going to have a city, holy city. And there is no way to control it. What comes on the agenda comes on the agenda. The prophet simply points the people back to the instructions, because where did this come from? From the Torah. You find then in Leviticus the 23rd chapter, you find the spring feast, the Messiah came and he completed his part. 22nd verse was then Gentiles' time. In it you find the time of deceit. In order for us then to experience then later the autumn feast, then we must return to the truth. So we are transitioning back to the truth. So then when we read the scripture in times of the time is at hand, the time is short, it has nothing to do with a situation that's past due. Absolutely no link with it. Time is at hand as if then we are then prior of. No, they knew they had at least a couple thousand years ahead of them. They were aware of it. But while they were explaining then the topics and understandings of the autumn feast, he simply said that time goes on where then this season will come. There is no point the time is at hand. That's wrong. The season of this time is coming. But then Gentiles, they were kind of floating around. They didn't understand. When came the holy Megillas of the time of Yohanan, there was a pile of Megillas. They did not know what to do with them. But they were perfectly, neatly put together. That's why when you read Revelation, it's extremely confusing. Of course, you are never taught in times and seasons. And Revelation is quite simple. However, the mind must function as then it used to function back in the old times when the Hebrews were around. That's why we are transitioning back to the truth. So then we can understand the truth, we think as of the truth. Renewing the minds with the instructions. So then we understand instructions. Because the season is coming. Maximum another 22 years. Then the vengeance starts. So there is not much time. From 20 to 22 years, and then vengeance around this time from 20 to 22 years, very maximum. That's why then Yahweh directed His people, because they were aware of this. So then the rest of the world, where they don't have the experience, neither the understanding of the holy prophecy, they're going to be caught unawares. They don't know. They're going to remain mocking around as the time of Noah, when people were mocking around. And then the time came. Because they don't understand how to read the holy prophecies and times and seasons and prophecies along with them. But then the copy that you have of the scripture was scandalized in purpose. They did not understand how to read it. And then when they translated, they made it in such a way where they would manipulate the people for their own gain. So the more we transition back to the truth, then the faster we understand. So every time when you read then the renewed covenant, and then you read a portion of it where the time is at hand, the time is near, those they do not give us the translation of it is very close, because it's not. You are reading from a time that it was at least a couple thousand years ahead. The understanding, when you read, you have to position yourself 2,000 years earlier. Is that truly at hand? No. It's not at hand. From the time you read, in order for your mind to educate itself in understanding times and seasons, it is not, because you are reading documents from 2,000 years plus ago. You don't shift your mind at the end of the fact. You remain at its original point. So when you read Revelation, you have to position yourself 2,000 years earlier. You have to educate your mind, remain the original point, and then remain there until you read through it. So from the time you understand Revelation, you have to understand you have 2,000 years in front of you. Because you educate your mind to be in line with the Scripture. You have first 1,000 and then the other 1,000. Then you have then the restoration, transitional time, then vengeance. So when you read, for instance, the previous covenant, you are reading in Leviticus, you have then to understand is 2,000 years plus another 2,000 years. Roughly. Then when you get to the time, the Messiah was born 3999, around 2,900. So then you begin to read the understanding from the prophet of 2,900 as an example. So then you educate your mind from that time that you are speaking of 2,900, then you have to understand. A few years later comes another prophet, another layer, and then another prophet, another layer, another prophet, another layer, comes the Messiah, 3999. Then you understand another 100, transition of time, another couple of thousand years, then nearing the end. So then the mind becomes to be educated rather than jumping around. Because it has to be steady. Your mind has to be steady. When you shift the reading, then you find the time and the season. Then you understand each year there is then set of times and seasons. When you read then Revelation, then you find those layers of understanding from the previous covenant and the renewed covenant, and then you match them. Then you understand the prophecies. Otherwise you don't understand. That's why Yahweh said He has set the sun, He has set then the lunar view of every month for record of time. And then He gave His holy Mikras, the Moadim. So then people would then track themselves prophetic and time, prophetic and time, prophetic and time. People are then educating themselves in understanding the Scripture so then they can help other people. Because at this very moment we are in 60-12, there is not much time. From 20 to 22 years, very maximum. There are transitions going on around the world, and politics are changing so fast. Extremely fast. And people, if they don't understand the Scripture, they are going to be left floating. In the spirit, they won't understand where they are standing at. So then, when you read Yohanan, you have a section of Yohanan speaking of precisely the time of the end. So then when you begin to understand from the viewpoint of Yohanan, Yohanan was then Shaliach. Yohanan the Beloved. He was founded then in a holy city. So when you read Yohanan, then you understand he was in a holy city. Speaking of Revelation. Then when you read what Yohanan told you, you have to position yourself 2,000 years earlier. 1,900 to 2,000 years. From there, then you begin to count your time. Time is in seasons, time is in seasons, time is in seasons, time is in seasons. We are transitioning from the time of deceit back into the truth. So where then the system of the world, the Chinese computerized system, is going to be implemented. And the nations are going to get busy. While his people then are going to cluster and form holy cities and give then directives to those people as they begin to prosper, because they have to have guidance. Otherwise they get overly hyper and then they begin to fight with each other. That's why there are then cities around giving them directives. Please stay tuned, much more coming up.